So I thought Cheryl's presentation was an interesting one, right? Because it reminds us that even as we try and imagine some new world, we talked about that on day one, right? What does a new world look like that transcends some of the easy dichotomies between East and West? We are going to be bypassing something and leaving something behind. And that may well be the source of conflict in and of itself, because you know, people don't just lament silently sometimes. There could well be a much more violent response to the kinds of change and transformation that we're envisioning. But let's take some questions, comments, reactions from all of you. We can do, I think, 2 or 3 at a time. We've got about half an hour, and I want to try and get as many in as we can. Let's start with Tonio, whose hands I saw went up very quickly.
So thank you. Some really fascinating talks, and thinking about the future as a historian, it's something that we're always thinking about, but we're not really encouraged to talk about, at least professionally. So I was struck, I've been sort of struck through this entire conference that one of the underlying things that we're all thinking about is climate change and the future. And East-West dialogue is vital because we have, as humans, we have to get along as never before, and so that's why this is so important. And a couple of you touched on it. And Cheryl's talk, for example, talked about highways. And in America right now, there's a movement that is actually receiving some support from very high up. Anthony Fox, for example, the Secretary of Transportation, has talked about the problem of highways dividing cities, and in fact being implicated in creating poverty within cities. And it seems to me that one of the things we all have to do as humans is like wean ourselves off of petroleum and the car. And I'd be very curious to just hear your perspectives on this fundamental thing we have to do to kind of move to the future, to create a more sustainable transportation system, I guess based less on the private automobile, whether it's electric or petroleum-based. It's still not a very efficient way to work. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. I think we had a question here as well. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. This is alluding to the... Okay. Hello? Yeah.
Okay, now
this is alluding to the degree of magnification or the scale represented in museums of the future. Because as the first few panelists have talked about, more transnational, more universal concerns. And Ms. Chung at the end, she mentioned us bypassing and kind of neglecting certain smaller narratives. So I was wondering to the first few speakers, like, what do you think of individual cultural identities and narratives of minorities in the outer future? Does it have a place in it, or will it be overshadowed in light of greater concerns? Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So minority cultural identities as well. Superb. All right, 2 hands here. Let's take both, and then we can have the panel respond. So why don't you go first? Yeah. I think we need a mic on this end, guys. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Based on the last person's question as well as what Cheryl just spoke, in a way we're sort of doing that in Singapore already. We've had Indian Heritage Center, Malay Heritage Center. I believe a couple of other things have come up in Chinatown. So maybe sort of looking back as what we have lost or to preserve what is our heritage. So they may be examples of the kind of museums of the future Cheryl is talking about. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, hi, thank you for all the brilliant talks. So as we've saying, the prospect of all the new technologies is really promising. And we see that art museums and new products that simulate future. However, I think the purpose of interaction with nature, nature, is more than lowering your stress level or appreciating the beauty of nature. Like when we interact with the real nature, we engage all our 5 senses and we perceive objects in the 3-dimensional world. So my concern is that, can artificial nature ever replace the real nature? Can artificial nature ever have the same emotional or philosophical impacts on people as real nature does? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so some quite broad-ranging questions there. Stu, if it's all right, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, so fantastic presentations, and it's continued on with the questions. So I'm really enjoying this, even though it's a late hour here.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll start with the last question because I think it was pointed towards something that both my presentation and Honors touched on. And I'll say, I won't try to speak for Honor, but I will say that the NaturePod project was really about asking that question. It appears to be an answer, and it may appear, if you aren't paying close attention, or if I didn't explain it very well, to be an affirmative answer. But it's actually it's dramatizing a possibility that's very clearly a temptation. That is to say, to use everything that we have in our technological arsenal to actually avoid rethinking from the ground up our relationship to our environment. It was difficult to cover everything adequately in just a few minutes, but I alluded at the end to the surprising fact for us that probably 90% of the hundreds of people who experienced that were positive about it, which really wasn't what we expected. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's what we intended. I think we thought we were working in a kind of yes men critical register with this kind of highly ironic product from the future that people would sort of be a bit disgusted by. But it was also pointed out to us that that there were use cases that we hadn't really thought about, like people who have agoraphobia and can't go outside, or people who are just for whatever reasons don't have the mobility to go out to a park. And in that context, simulated nature may well be far better than nothing at all. So I mean, I think I share the questioner's concern about that temptation to have the simulacrum replace the reality. But the purpose of the project was to dramatize a possibility so we could have that conversation now rather than in 3 or 4 years' time when this thing really is on the market and really is a choice that we begin to make. I wanted to just quickly touch on something that the second questioner brought up about the importance of customizing futures to different cultures and to different people. I mean, to me, that's just utterly central to the whole practice. Futures, I think, can often, discourse about the future can often be just completely unmoored from any sense of place, any sense of history, any sense of the particular values of a community, other than perhaps Silicon Valley. And so there's a deeply kind of facilitative and pluralistic underpinning to the tradition that I'm working in, and that Jim Data and his many acolytes, including John, and overlap with a lot of others on the stage too, actually, that we're operating in. And Nandi says that the purpose of futures, Ashish Nandi, an Indian intellectual and a fantastic futurist, says that the purpose of futures is to play the game of dissenting visions. A game of dissenting visions, which is a phrase that I love because it captures this idea that actually our responsibility is constantly to question the received wisdom about the future and to provide alternatives. And that is not or should not be a solely centralized function, but a devolved one, a shared capacity, and a part of the motivation for the experiential work that I shared, although it may not have been apparent, is to increase the accessibility, the range of languages, literally and figuratively, in which this stuff can be done, so that it isn't just issued from nameless bureaucracies that traffic in white papers. There are other ways of futuring, and everyone should be doing it in one way or another.
Great, thank you, Stu. Let me see if the rest of the panel have any assenting or dissenting visions, or consenting ones if you like.
I just want to come in on your question and also Antonio's kind of comment about climate change, because I think they're linked. As with Stuart, I certainly was not trying to make the impression that digital technology, albeit immersive, can replace nature. On the contrary, I think there's a role for a museum like ours, which includes immersive experiences, to actually create those relationships with nature that might be being lost in extremely urbanized environments such as Singapore. There's an urgent requirement to make those connections with nature, precisely because of the threat of climate change. And when we think about museums as being places for memory and even grieving, this is particularly potent. There's a work in our exhibition which shows islands disappearing under the rising sea levels. This is going to happen in our lifetime. I come from the South Pacific, from New Zealand, and we're already planning a strategy now of how we rehome the people of Tuvalu, for instance. This is going to happen. And so there's an urgent need, I think, for museums of today and museums of the future to start these conversations now, as Stuart says, rather than in 3 years' time or 5 years' time when it's too late.
Sheila, any thoughts on climate change as a security threat in particular?
Well, I think it's very clear, at least in the United States, amongst many people, that climate change is the #1 national security issue facing our nation. We have so much of the U.S. population living in littoral regions near the sea, and as global climate change rises, much of Florida, for example, will be underwater. And so a huge part of our resources have to be planned. I think also the transportation industry is becoming far more understanding of what global climate change is working on. And many of the visionarios that I've been developing have to do with changing U.S. energy consumption patterns, transportation patterns, how driving, for example, should be outlawed. It should, vehicles need to be driven only by computers, and driving should only be for emergencies, because the increase in efficiency alone will change the entire equation. And of course, when you begin to create electricity through alternative fuel capabilities, you then begin to truly reduce your carbon footprint. And the concepts of carbon footprint reduction have taken on whole new meanings and are being taken far more seriously. Though we do have these what we call climate deniers in our society, and we have to wrestle with those issues as well.
Thank you. John?
I suppose I've tasked myself with being this sort of dystopic voice, so I'm just going to go for it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced a number of scenarios and publications, and one of them has that by the 2080s, anywhere between 1.8 to 5.2 billion people will be in precarity due to sea level rise. So again, when we think about that, I just want to be as blunt as possible. We're not prepared for that future. Mm-hmm. We are not. So my doctoral dissertation is actually on geoengineering, because I think someone's going to up the ante, and we've already seen interventions related to cloud seeding and low level. So how do people try to then move towards, and I think we've seen terraforming, whether it's like land reclamation, but like large-scale climate interventions, and this is being taken seriously by a variety of groups. And that for me shows that obviously these questions surrounding these post-oil futures and questions around identity and values and the artificiality of nature really need to be fit, I think, into a larger framework, but that one that has to be brought down to the local level. So all the work that I do for different UN agencies, and I fly back to Bosnia and Herzegovina tonight, starts with the question of values at the communal level. Like, what values are important to us, and also doing work with different Muslim communities in Eastern Europe, I think is really essential. But I also try to bring in ways that problematize. So for example, for me, nature with a capital N is a really difficult and maybe even not very useful term. I mean, what's nature? The UNESCO garden that's here? I don't think that's nature. I think that's a form and a kind of nature. And I think there's a great book by Tim Morton called Ecology Without Nature that looks at the romanticization of nature as a concept. And I think in general, if we loop this back into this climate change, it's precisely what Bruno Latour is talking about in We Have Never Been Modern. Modernity convinced us that culture and nature were somehow separate. But climate change shows us in a very visceral way that we've never been separate from nature. we've just bracketed it off, right? And now it's coming home to roost. And so I think these questions around national security, around identity, are forcing us to work across scales, which for me is really essential. So in all the engagements, it's how can we think local, regional, global, and find ways of shifting those perspectives. And I think obviously, Stuart's work in using artifacts to bring people into the future and to bring the future into the present is really critical. And then certainly Cheryl's idea of the bridge and the bypass, because we need to think through that precisely because of what Aaron said. I think that's where the insights are for us. It's not just this sort of, we have our vision, we're marching towards this future, but can we move into those other sorts of spaces? Can we again, as I repeated, can we think the unthought? Can we find ways of having that kind of questioning then guide us, hopefully to a better space, but again, with no guarantees?
I think for me, so one of the areas, my day job, when I'm not being a social entrepreneur, my day job is at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where I look at futures and public policy. And I think that one of the key things about futures in the public policy context is that you don't get to choose your citizens, right? So, you have to serve everyone, and there is what we call you have to be, there's a representative kind of model. It's Obama's comments about, it'd be great if I ran a Silicon Valley tech company, right? But government doesn't have this luxury of picking and choosing. And I think that becomes very interesting. So when Adrian and I do futures work at the school, one of the questions that we ask ourselves is a question of who is not at the table. And who is, and how do we include people who are not at the table or voices that are not at the table into decision making about the future. I've been reading a little bit of work by a sociologist called Ali Hochschild, who did a study. She recently released a book called Strangers in Our Own Land, and she talks about the deep story of Trump supporters in Louisiana, right? And the way she puts it is to tell this story of there is a group of people, whether you agree with them or not being beside the point, but there is a group of people whose lived experience is they see themselves as having stood in line for the American dream for years and years and years and years. And they've been patiently waiting in line and patiently waiting in line. And then suddenly you have immigrants cutting in, African Americans cutting in, Asians cutting in. And then you see Obama in the distance waving hordes of people to cut in line in front of you. And you start to feel like you're left behind, you're a stranger in your own land. And I think that for me, those are the kinds of questions that I hope futures work dares to address before we get to the curious position that we are currently in, in terms of politics, right? Because it's about gaining that empathy for people who have lost something, right? Who don't have a place in actually that vision of the future, and what do we do, and how can we help them, right? I think that's a conversation that kind of needs to happen. Just talk a little bit briefly about the transportation part of my last government rotation was actually in the Ministry of Transport. I think one of the interesting things, and when I was preparing for this talk, I came across the work of a gentleman called Robert Moses, who did a lot of basically transportation infrastructure development in New York in the 30s to 50s, 60s. And in some ways, his planning and urban planning design was actually quite discriminatory. So one of the more famous case studies is how he basically built bridges and highways around to get to Long Island, for example, around Long Island, and they were too low for buses to go under, which basically meant that it effectively cut off access to people who weren't able to travel by car. And these are things that we need to be more sensitive to, because something like, let's say, transportation infrastructure is tens of years in the making. It's an investment that is done very, very early on. And if we don't have these upfront conversations about who is being left behind, who is being included or excluded, then I think that becomes quite challenging, because you get a lock into a physical design that you have to live with for quite a long time.
Yeah. And And that has huge implications for not just the question on who's included, but also how do we cultivate the kind of global cosmopolitanism that is necessary for some of the problems that Tonio talked about, right, in his question. Because you can't solve that if people are just focusing on who's left out of the whole discussion. So I think that kind of cluster of questions actually ended up with a lot deeper interconnections than might have initially been obvious. I think we have time for one more round of questions. So let's see if we can take 3 or 4 of them. And of course, this is when we will have 8. Yeah, it always happens, classic human nature, but let's work with as many as we can get. All right, Takai, let's start with you.
So thanks, this is really interesting. By the way, very good point about who's left behind, but the Trump narrative, given that the average Trump supporters have $20,000 US more income than the other side, is probably a little bit misleading. But my question to the panel is, especially in my line of work, in artificial intelligence, to me, one of the biggest impacts in what's going to happen before 2050, aside from climate change, is the ramifications of that. So I didn't really hear anything so far that was directly addressing those themes in the Museum of the Future, and I was wanting to put the question to the panel, what do you think about how to capture that?
Cool. All right, so artificial intelligence. Where were our other hands? Julina, let's take you. Yeah. I'm going to get through as many as I can.
Hi, good morning. My name is Julina. I'm actually from the Malay Heritage Foundation, it's not really a question, but more as a comment to 2 other things that came about earlier. One is about whether there's a place for the narratives of the different cultural identities within that bigger narrative, and the gentleman's comment about how the different museums from the different or heritage institutions of the different ethnic groups have kind of helped to address that. Maybe I try to share coming from an organization that actually manages one of them. Okay, so as a foundation, we do oversee the Malay Heritage Center, so which is a heritage institution and also a museum of sorts. So one of the challenges we face is how do we also become future-driven in terms of how do we present that history and that narrative? Because we know that we're going to be addressing a new generation of people who may not have grown up with how the Malay narrative has been forwarded for so many years. At the same time, there's always that challenge of people who always feel that, oh, the museum just need more artifacts so that we can explain the history and the heritage. So I think this was one of the key challenges about how do we then place, for me, I think there's always a place for these individual cultural narratives or identity to be a part of the bigger narrative, about. The other thing I wanted to also share is someone mentioned about whether or not technology can totally override the whole actual experience of being in nature and stuff like that. And I think it's not just in the realm of museums that we discuss these things. The other area that some of these ideas have also been shared, actually in movie making. There is a movie sometime back where, I don't remember the title, but the actor was Bruce Willis. And basically, it's really about how they use technology, very immersive. All he or she needs to do is just stay in the room, plug themselves into that monitor on that chair, and they can do almost anything and everything, including police investigation, catching thieves, and everything. But at the end of the story, what happened was they unplugged themselves because they still want to experience the real world. So I think that's still that moral question or that moral need to always interact with the real thing. And I think whether you're a futurist or whether you want to think about the future, I think that's really one question that you also need to always deal with. Yeah, okay, so that's my contribution today.
All right, thank you. Now, oh God, there's like 10 questions now. All right, I'm going to say, I'll just make an executive call. Let's get questions from people we haven't heard from so far this morning. So that will help me whittle things down slightly. Why don't we give the mic to the young gentleman just next to you first, and then we can,
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm
going to ask if we can make the questions as brief as possible.
So my question will be, since we're building a museum, where exactly we want to build this museum at? Like which country or which city will we start with to spread it globally, and so that every city and every state can have their own museum to discuss about the future and about East and West. Okay. Thank you.
Great. So where would the museum be? Who's next? Yep. and then we'll come across this way.
Yeah. Hi. I would like to go back to the issue of climate change. Because there's been many global and international protocols and environmental agreements that has been made, but to very limited successes. So what makes you think that museums, by targeting smaller communities with museums and raising their awareness will help? Because raising awareness for the small community actually doesn't have much effect to me. Because what I feel is that even though we have this knowledge of environmental climate change, but what do we do about it?
Okay, great. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, this question is directed to Deputy Director Chung in particular. So in your presentation, you gave a comparison of Robertson Quay and Jalan Kukong. So I just wanted to ask, in your comparison, it seems to me that you painted a picture that Robertson Quay is very developed and Jalan Kukong is very underdeveloped. So do you think that is there any way in which Jalan Kukong might be in fact better off than Robertson Quay?
Interesting. Right, let's start with Cheryl's response here on Robertson Quay and Jalan Kukong first, and then the panel can share your thoughts on whichever of these questions resonates most with you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think for me, what I hear in your question is a level of empathy and kind of concern about an area which has been left behind. There's one thing which I didn't put in my slides, which is in the comparison was about similarities between Robertson Quay and Jalan Kukong. And one similarity is that they're both transition areas. So Robertson Quay, because it's a very highly expatriate area, obviously a lot of people rent, and they're here maybe on 2-3 year contracts or whatever, so they don't typically stay very long. I would say that that's also in many cases the same for Jalan Kukong, because Jalan Kukong is, if I'm not wrong, is about 10% of all rental housing in Singapore is in that area. So because rental housing does take in people who are often in a very unstable kind of life situation at that point, that's also quite a high transition area. For me, what I hope to see, and this is where I'm slightly less sentimental about the geography of the place, but what I hope to see is if there is circulation in Jalan Kukong, that means people who need a place to stay and end up there for a period have that option, and then are able to get out of that situation and move on. I don't think that that's a bad thing, because it's almost like by design, because of the concentration of rental flats, the area will always be a low-income area. So for me, the question I'm thinking about is really then, how do you help people transition out of that area, and use that place as a safety net in a way, and concentrate help in that area to get people out. The fact that it is a low-income area, to me, is not as much of a concern. I do, however, wonder, and every time I'm in Jalan Kukong, I think about this, how it feels like to live there when Robertson Quay is just across the street. And I wonder whether it's an aspiration or a or kind of a disappointment in their situation.
You started your talk with a quote from The Tale of Two Cities, but there's another book that I was actually thinking of which responds directly to that point, which is an amazing novel by China Melville called The City in the City. And this is where you have a geographical city, but two cities more or less superimposed along, on top of one another. And the population of one city is trained to unsee the other population. And I suspect that might be happening in Robertson Quay and Jalan Kukong. As someone who used to live there, I think you have a lot of unseeing happening, which happens in these environments. I just wanted to pick up on the AI question, because I think it actually relates to your question as well around, kind of how connected or unconnected do we want to be, with this Museum of the Future. We just had an exhibition at ArtScience Museum called Big Bang Data, And we took people on this immersive journey into, you know, kind of what data is doing for us, how it's transforming us, big narrative in there about smart city and smart nation. And we sort of paused the narrative just towards the end to, you know, kind of to ask our visitors to reflect on what data can't tell us and what the limitations of, you know, kind of big data are, and crucially where that might start intersecting with narratives around artificial intelligence and automation. Because there's a really urgent requirement in the same way that we need to be having conversations about climate change. We also need to be having conversations around artificial intelligence and automation now, rather than, you know, kind of waiting. So I believe there's a very important role for our Museum of the Future in stimulating those conversations.
Yeah, Sheila?
One of the key things that we hope to put in the museum on the Mall in Washington was a virtual element where anyone could register their thoughts and opinions about the narratives that we would be showing within the museum, but also because the United States has representative citizens from virtually every other nation on the planet, we were hoping to make it a global conversation and a place for some of the global conversations to take place regarding a whole spectrum of issues, both social and technological, across an entire spectrum of sociological, technological, economic, environmental, and political areas. So that was our vision. Whether or not we can make it a reality is another whole issue.
Great. Yeah, John. We haven't answered the question on climate change yet, by the way. So
right, I wanted to weave together some of the themes that I've heard in some of these issues. So at least for me, thinking about the ramifications of AI or how heritage can be future-driven, or this idea that any useful idea about the future should appear to be ridiculous, always has a caveat, and that is that not all ridiculous ideas are useful. And the question about absurdity is absurd for whom? So when you're a futurist and you spend your life kind of, you know, doing this, your tolerance for that really starts to rise. But I just spent 2 days with 80 national planners in the Philippines looking at 2040 National Vision, the new president's 10-year plan, Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So I think a number of people hit on this, and Cheryl's always amazing about this. Foresight is important because at some moment the rubber hits the road. And so it has to be useful. There has to be some sort of import. We talked yesterday about, and Aaron was talking about the F1 and the way that the driver thinks versus the support team versus the people planning the event, right? So thinking about those different temporalities that Adrian was mentioning, I think is really essential. And so at least for me, something like climate change or something like the potentiality of AI to thwart humanity, again, really forces us to ask these questions about value. And I don't think enough of that is done. And I think, you know, Stuart's point about the sort of Silicon Valley narrative that gets swept up in a lot of very tech-driven futures. Certainly as someone who would consider themselves and has no problem calling himself a futurist, a lot of it makes me cringe. And there are certainly spaces where people get swept away, and it is the next big thing. But at the heart of futures, if we can continue asking the questions about what's next and what if, but always from a particular perspective, always value-driven, then I think we're doing the work that needs to be done. And again, the solutions aren't apparent. They're not easy, and I think they do require different kinds of identity, collective, collaborative spaces for hopefully, again, asking better questions and moving towards better solutions.
Great, John. Thank you. And I saved the last word for Stuart because I want to make sure that it's worthwhile him staying up this late in Chicago.
But will it be worthwhile for you is the question. So as I'm listening to the conversation, I'm asking myself about the function of the museum as an institution. And it seems to me that although we began our offerings in most cases with a kind of artifactual or material focus, the question for the Museum of the Future is not what can it store, but what can it activate? And I think this is this question is beginning to, I mean, maybe not in those terms, but is beginning to find its way into the way museums actually work. And towards the point of the last questioner who was raising the question of the the importance or dispensability of physical locations versus virtual engagement. I mean, this is certainly something that we saw in Honor's presentation about the ArtScience Museum. It's not about having a bunch of stuff. It's about enabling people to engage with their possibilities and with their agency in a certain way. You also see this. I mean, I spent a few months ago. I spent a period as the first fellow at the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro, which just opened in December last year and welcomed its millionth visitor last month. 10% of those million, by the way, have never been to a museum before. So, Rio de Janeiro is a really variegated population in terms of socioeconomic background and culture and so on. But it's not filled with stuff. It's filled with opportunities to ask and answer questions. And that, I think, is the critical function of the museum, is to make us muse, not just to hold collections, as valuable as those may be. And so with that in mind, the reason that I've been focusing for the last 10 years on what I call experiential futures, certainly not just artifacts. I mean, that was the focus of tonight, so that's where or this morning for you. So that's where I started. But, really it's about what you can activate. And two of my favorite experiential scenarios that I've ever participated in have been done by my students. And one touches on AI and the other touches on loss. So the AI one was about was a product launch, not unlike a kind of Steve Jobs Apple product launch, for a toy, a children's toy, perhaps 15 years from now, which was a talking dog with an AI engine inside called Pepper. And the dog is a tutor and a friend and really a counselor to the child that it pairs with. And it gets to know that child so well that it can basically, scaffold that child's development in a way that might, in the little experience we had, the 20-minute time machine that these students ran, it's very hard to explain, verbally and over Skype, but it was really moving and it was really disturbing to see this hypothetical technology actually begin to creep into a space of being more effective at parenting that child than many parents are. So that was one, and that was working with one sort of hypothetical space dealing with AI. And another, speaking of activating in the spaces we've been talking about today, one was an exhibition dedicated to the lost world of agriculture. So this was set in Canada 20 years from now, at a time when there are no more human farmers, because it's all automated and controlled by artificial intelligence. So this was a natural history kind of museum exhibit dedicated to what is no longer a human community. And it had this kind of tragic, elegiac tone about it that's really, again, hard to explain, but that really made us think, those of us who were fortunate enough to be there at this OCAD University installation, made us really think about the impending grief and loss, to borrow from Cheryl's insight, that comes with the change of the things that we're so inclined to embrace technologically. So the last comment I want to make to this point about capacities brings it back to the theme of the conference and the East and West as kind of great big hulking cultural categories, and the whole idea of the late Alvin Toffler gave the world the concept of future shock, right? In his book, in his 1970 book. And it was really developed by analogy with culture shock. So the idea was that if you don't develop a relationship with the future and sort of think about it in the present, then as it arrives, you sort of feel disoriented. And the analogy was for, to people who, if you go to another part of the world and don't speak the language and don't know the norms and kind of are out of your element, you are not as effective. And that analogy, I think, there are some things about that book that are showing their age, but I think it's a pretty astute perspective to remind us that what we're talking about when we're talking about preparing for the future is a sort of cultural literacy and a flexibility and a willingness to understand different cultures, different points of view, different life ways is sort of the prototype for futures literacy. So I think this conversation has been has offered a lot of great food for thought in that regard.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stuart. Now, it's impossible, of course, to summarize any of this, and I know we've gone a little bit over time, but we did start a bit late, and I wanted to make sure we had time for at least those 2 rounds of questions. I thought it was incredibly worthwhile, and I wanted to end by kind of asking everybody how much of the quote from A Tale of Two Cities that Cheryl put up you actually read. I mean, we all know the first 2 lines, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. 2 of the best known lines in literature. But if you look at the rest of them, one thing I'm always struck by is the number of polarities that Dickens mentions there that need to be balanced, right? It was the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness, the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, the season of darkness, the spring of hope, the winter of despair, so on and so on and so forth, right? And the thing I'm always struck by with that is that actually East and West are 2 examples of polarities as well. But if we look closely enough at them, or if we look from far enough, then the polarities start to come a bit more into perspective. You start to see that they can be part of a continuum. East and West, in our case, might well be just parts of lines on a circle. So east of West becomes even more east or more west, and it all gets a bit confusing at that point, right? But the bigger point there is to say that when we ask ourselves where we go from here, I think it's an important thing to bear in mind that we will have to learn to transcend those polarities. That the terms East and West are helpful. They help conceptually categorize some things, but at some point we also need to move beyond them, just as Dickens moves beyond best and worst, foolishness and wisdom, hope and despair. And when we do that, I think we will find that we can manage past and present, the whole and the part a lot more effectively, short time and long time, to go back to what Adrian spoke about earlier, multiple identities, like what Vernie mentioned, and hopefully find us ways to create new categories and labels that are fit for purpose in this complex and ambiguous and very volatile time that we live in. So let me end this panel on that note. Stuart, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all the panelists as well. This is fantastic. I love all the ideas and how they've come together. And we'll hand back to Jan Vasbinder now for a final closing word on the whole conference.